My husband's secretary got pregnant with twins. I never expected my mother-in-law to offer me $130 million. The phone was not supposed to be on the counter. Daniel always kept it in his jacket pocket. Always. Every evening without fail. The way other men kept their watches or their keys. But that Tuesday night he had come in from the rain shaking drops off his coat, and had set the phone down without thinking, and Margaret had seen the screen light up before he had a chance to turn it over. She was not a suspicious woman. That was the thing people would never understand later, when the story made its rounds and everyone had an opinion about what she should have seen coming. She had never once gone through his phone. She had never hired anyone to follow him. She had married a man she trusted, and she had trusted him the way you trust a floor you have stood on for 11 years. Not because you check it every morning, but because it has never given way beneath you. The message was short. The doctor confirmed it today. Twins. We need to tell her soon. She deserves to know. Margaret read it twice. Her eyes were very steady. Her hands were very steady. She set down the dish towel she had been holding, and she walked to the kitchen table and she sat down. The kettle on the stove began to whistle, and she let it whistle until it gave up and went quiet. She was 41 years old. She had a degree in architecture from a university she had worked 3 jobs to attend. She had spent the first 4 years of her marriage helping Daniel stabilize his family's company, during a period when the finances were ugly, and the pressure was crushing, and she had done it without complaining, without asking for recognition, without keeping score, because she had believed with her whole heart that a marriage was not a scoreboard. She had poured herself into that belief the way you pour water into a cup you are certain is solid. The cup, it turned out, had a crack in it. She heard Daniel come in from the hallway. She heard him stop when he saw her at the table. She did not look up. She heard him breathe. "Margaret," he said. She said nothing. He came around the table, and he saw her face, and whatever he had been preparing to say came apart in his mouth. He stood in front of her, and he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had been building a lie for 3 years, and had just watched it collapse in a kitchen on a Tuesday evening. "How long?" she said. Her voice was very quiet. It was the quietest voice she had ever heard herself use. He said 3 years. She nodded once. She got up from the table. She walked to the bedroom. She locked the door, and she sat down on the floor with her back against the side of the bed, and she stayed there for a long time. She did not cry. This surprised her. She had always thought, in the abstract way that people think about disasters that have not yet arrived, that news like this would produce tears, would produce shaking, would produce the kind of collapse that required other people to hold you together. But what she felt instead was something colder and much older than grief. It was a feeling she recognized from the hardest years of her childhood, from the years before her mother found stability, and the ground had shifted constantly beneath them. It was the feeling of a person who has just been reminded of something they already knew at a very deep level, that the world does not owe you the things you built your life around. She called her lawyer at 20 minutes to 10. Her lawyer was a woman named Clara Ford. Clara had handled the prenuptial agreement 11 years ago, and she had handled 2 property purchases and the structuring of Margaret's architecture firm, which Margaret had built from 3 clients and a spare room into a 16-person practice that had completed 14 public buildings across the city. Clara answered on the 3rd ring. "I need to meet with you," Margaret said. "First appointment you have tomorrow." Clara, to her credit, asked no questions. 8 in the morning, she said. "I will have coffee." Margaret ended the call. She sat on the floor a little longer. Through the door she could hear Daniel walking back and forth in the hallway, the muffled sounds of a man who wanted to knock but did not dare to. At some point she heard him go to the guest room. She heard the door close. She stayed on the floor until her legs went stiff, and then she got up, washed her face, and got into bed. She did not sleep for a long time, but when she did sleep, she slept deeply, which was strange, and which she only understood later. Something had shifted inside her, some enormous and exhausting effort of maintenance she had been performing without knowing it. The effort of trusting a man she should perhaps have watched more carefully had simply stopped. She was tired in the way of someone who has just put down a very heavy bag. By the time she walked into Clara's office at 8 the next morning, she had already written down every asset she was aware of, every account, every property, every investment and silent partnership and shared liability. She set the list on Clara's desk and watched her lawyer's eyes move down it. "You have been thorough," Clara said. "I always was," Margaret said. "He just never noticed." The silent partnership was the piece neither of them had discussed in detail before. When Daniel's company had been struggling in the early years of their marriage, Margaret had restructured her own savings, liquidated an inheritance from her grandfather, and injected capital into the business. At the time, Daniel had suggested they formalize it. He had suggested it casually, as a tax arrangement, and she had agreed. The paperwork had been filed and then both of them had moved on, and over the years the arrangement had faded into the background of their financial life, the way things fade when they are never in dispute. It was not decorative paperwork. It represented a real share of a company that had since grown very large. Clara looked at her over the rim of her glasses. "Margaret, do you understand what this means?" Margaret understood. She had spent the night understanding it. She did not feel victorious. She felt something closer to exhaustion and clarity arriving at the same time, which is its own particular feeling. She had not structured that arrangement to protect herself. She had done it because it was the right business decision at the time. She had been looking after something she believed was hers and Daniel's together. The fact that it now protected her alone was not a strategy. It was just the truth of what she had always been contributing, finally visible. Daniel came to her that same evening with a settlement offer. He stood in the living room of their house, the house Margaret had designed the interior of herself, down to the placement of the windows in the east-facing wall to catch the morning light, and he held out a folder and told her he wanted this handled with dignity. She looked at the number on the first page. She handed the folder back. "I have a lawyer," she said. "You should talk to her." He looked at her for a moment. He had the expression of a man who had expected a different scene. He had expected, she realized, tears or anger or negotiation. He had expected her to meet him somewhere emotional, somewhere he could manage her. She gave him nothing to manage. She went to bed at 9:30. She had a project deadline in 4 days, and she intended to meet it. 3 days later, a call came from a number she recognized but had not heard in some time. The name on the screen made her pause for just a moment before she answered. It was Eleanor Baxter, Daniel's mother. Eleanor was 73 years old. She was a woman who had raised 2 sons in a family business that was demanding and unforgiving, and she had done it while also running the administrative side of that business for 20 years, before Daniel's father handed formal control to the next generation. She was not a warm woman in the easy sense. She did not hug freely or compliment often, but she was a woman whose judgment Margaret had always respected, because it was precise, and because it was never wasted on things that did not matter. She had called Daniel's personal line, not the house line, not through Daniel, directly to Margaret. "Come and see me," Eleanor said. "Come alone." Margaret did not ask why. She said she would be there on Saturday morning. She put the phone down. She stood in her kitchen for a moment in the quiet of her own house, in the life she had built and was now in the process of unwinding. She thought about Eleanor and what she might want. She thought about Daniel, somewhere in this city managing the fallout of his own decisions. She thought about the twins, 2 small lives that had not asked to be born into this particular wreckage. She felt nothing like a victim. This surprised her most of all. She had thought, before this week, that betrayal on this scale would make a person feel small. It had not made her feel small. It had made her feel something she was still finding words for. Clear. That was the closest word. She felt clear in a way she had not felt in a long time, as though something that had been blurring her vision for years had simply been wiped away, and now she could see the exact shape of her life, the exact dimensions of what she had built, and who she was, and what she was worth. She was 41 years old. She had built a career, a home, and more than she had yet been given credit for. She was not finished. She arrived at Eleanor's house on Saturday at 10 in the morning. The house was in the older part of the city, a neighborhood that had not changed much in 30 years, because the people who lived there had never needed it to. Eleanor had refused to move when Daniel's father passed, and the children had suggested something newer and easier. She had lived in this house for 41 years, and she had told her sons she intended to die in it, and they had learned, over time, not to bring it up again. The front door opened before Margaret could knock. Eleanor was standing in the doorway in a pale blue dress and the same posture she always carried, the posture of a woman who had decided long ago that she would not shrink. "You found it easily," Eleanor said. "I have been here before," Margaret said. 12 times. Eleanor looked at her steadily. Then she stepped back and held the door open. The sitting room was cool and full of morning light. Eleanor had made tea herself, which Margaret noted. She had not asked her housekeeper to prepare anything. She had made it with her own hands, which was a statement of intent for a woman of Eleanor's household. They sat. Eleanor poured. She did not begin with pleasantries, and Margaret respected that. "I want to tell you something," Eleanor said, "that I have told no one else in this family." Margaret held her cup in both hands and waited. "When Harold and I married," Eleanor said, "my father gave us land. Not Harold's family. My father, the Baxter land in the north of this country, which was worth then what land is worth now, multiplied by what 40 years of development and oil revenue will do. My father also gave us his trading connections, which were older than this country's current borders, and which were the actual foundation of what became the Baxter Osei Company." She paused and sipped her tea. "I signed documents I was told were standard. I was told they were tax arrangements. I was 24 years old and I was in love, and I believed my husband." She set down her cup with a very small, precise sound. "I understood what I had signed 2 years into the marriage, when I tried to ask about the northern land, and was told, gently, that it was company property now." Margaret said nothing. She was listening with her whole body. "I spent 47 years building that company from the inside," Eleanor continued, "managing suppliers, managing staff, managing crises that Harold brought home at 10 at night and needed solved by morning. I was never on the letterhead. I was never at the board meetings. I was the structure the building stood on, and the building never once looked down to see what was holding it up." She looked at Margaret directly. "I have watched you," she said, "for 11 years. I know what you put into that company in the early years. I know about the capital injection. I know about the restructuring work you did when the contracts in the eastern region collapsed. I know these things because I was paying attention when no one else was. It is what women like us do. We pay attention." Margaret's hands were completely still around her cup. "What Daniel has done," Eleanor said, "is a shameful thing. But what I am about to offer you is not a response to what Daniel has done. It is a correction. A correction to something that has been wrong in this family for a long time." She reached to the side table and picked up a folder. She placed it on the cushion between them. "Open it," she said. Margaret set down her tea. She opened the folder. She turned the first page, and the second, and on the third page she found the number that would change the entire shape of what she understood was possible. $130 million. She read the surrounding language carefully. It was not a settlement. It was not a gift in the legal sense. It was a formal restructuring of the Baxter Osei Family Trust, in which Eleanor held majority beneficiary status, and in which Eleanor was exercising her right to redistribute a designated portion to a named recipient. The recipient was Margaret. Margaret looked up from the folder. "This is real," she said. It was not a question. "I have had 3 firms verify it," Eleanor said. "My lawyers spent 6 weeks building it so that no one can touch it. Not Daniel, not his brother, not anyone." Margaret looked back down at the document. She was not a person who was easily overwhelmed. She had received hard news in her life, and she had received good news, and she had generally learned to process both from a place of steadiness. But this moment was something different. This was not luck. This was not charity. What Eleanor had constructed was an argument, a legal argument, a moral argument, and a deeply personal argument, that everything Margaret had contributed had always been worth exactly this much. She had just never been told. "Why now?" Margaret said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird moved through the garden. A breeze shifted the curtains at the open window. "Because," Eleanor said finally, "I am 73 years old, and I am tired of watching women in this family build things, and then watch men sign their names to them." She looked at Margaret steadily. "And because you never once asked me for anything. In 11 years. Not once." Margaret sat with that. There will be a fight, Eleanor said. Daniel will contest it. His lawyers will try every door. You should know that before you sign anything. I know, Margaret said. It will take time. It will be unpleasant. There will be things written about you that are not true. I know, Margaret said again. Eleanor looked at her for a moment, with an expression that Margaret had never seen on her face before. It was not exactly warmth. It was something more durable than warmth. It was the look of one person recognizing another across a very old distance. Good, Eleanor said. She picked up her tea. Then we understand each other. Margaret stayed for 2 hours. They did not talk about Daniel after that. They talked about the trust structure. They talked about timelines. Eleanor explained the legal mechanisms with the fluency of someone who had spent 6 weeks learning them from the inside out, and Margaret listened and asked precise questions and took notes in the small notebook she always carried. When she stood to leave, Eleanor walked her to the front door. She held it open and stood in the frame of it, the way she had stood when Margaret arrived. Margaret, she said. Margaret turned. You built more than you know, in more places than you realize. She paused. It is time someone said so out loud. Margaret drove home in the quiet of a Saturday morning. The city was still slow around her, still finding its pace. She drove through streets she had driven 1,000 times, and they looked different to her now. Not because anything about them had changed, because something about the way she was seeing had. She had walked into that house as a woman in the middle of a painful unraveling. She was leaving it as something else. She did not yet have the exact word for it, but she felt the weight of the folder on the passenger seat beside her, and she felt the steadiness of her own hands on the wheel, and she thought of Eleanor in her sitting room pouring tea she had made herself, and she understood, for the first time, what it meant to be seen by someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. The fight that was coming would be hard. Eleanor had been clear about that, and Margaret believed her. But Margaret had spent 11 years doing hard things quietly, and coming out the other side with her work intact, and her judgment sound, and her hands still capable of building something worth building. She was not afraid of a fight. She was, if anything, more ready for one than she had ever been in her life. She pulled into the driveway of her house and sat in the car for a moment. The morning light hit the east-facing windows exactly the way she had designed them to. She had stood in this driveway with blueprints in her hands and had chosen that angle herself, had argued for it against the contractor who thought it was impractical, had been right. She was almost always right. She had just spent 11 years letting someone else take credit for the results. That, she decided, was over. She got out of the car. She walked to the front door. She had a project to finish and a lawyer to call, and a folder sitting in her passenger seat that was going to change everything. She was ready. The legal process began on a Monday, and by Friday, it had already become the kind of thing that fills inboxes and conference rooms with the particular tension of money and family and wounded pride all pressing against each other at the same time. Margaret's lawyer, Clara, had a team of 4 people working alongside her. Eleanor's legal team, which was separate and independent, had been preparing for this moment for 6 weeks, and Daniel's lawyers, who had been hired quickly and in a state of obvious alarm, were running hard to catch up. Margaret was at her architecture firm every morning by 8. She had a community library project in the final stages of approval, and she was not going to let it slip. Her team of 16 people depended on her. Her clients depended on her. She had spent 11 years building something that belonged entirely to her, and she was not going to let a legal battle take her attention away from it. She answered legal emails between 9 and 10 each morning, and between 4 and 5 each afternoon. The rest of the day was her work. This discipline, Clara told her privately, was also a strategy. A woman who shows up to her office every day and continues to function at a high level is not a woman who can be painted as desperate or unstable or reactive. Margaret had not chosen it as a strategy. She had chosen it because she was not the kind of person who could sit still while something she cared about needed to be done, but the effect was the same. Daniel's initial response to the trust restructuring was exactly what Eleanor had predicted. He arrived at Eleanor's house 3 days after the legal notification was filed, and the conversation that took place there was, by the account Eleanor gave Margaret afterward, brief and one-directional. Daniel spoke at length. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When he finished, she told him that she had made her decision with full legal capacity and full awareness of its implications, and that she did not intend to revisit it. He left without a resolution, and his lawyers began filing challenges the following morning. The challenges were specific. They argued that Eleanor had been unduly influenced. They argued that the trust restructuring had not followed proper procedure. They argued, in one particularly creative filing, that Margaret had cultivated a relationship with Eleanor specifically to gain access to family assets. Margaret read that last argument on a Thursday evening sitting at her kitchen table with a glass of water, and she felt a particular kind of anger that was very quiet and very cold and very useful. She had not cultivated anything. She had shown up to Eleanor's house 12 times in 11 years. She had remembered Eleanor's preferences and asked about her health and treated her with respect. If that counted as cultivation, then the entire world had been misusing the word. She wrote down 3 specific facts she wanted Clara to include in the response filing. Then she went to bed. The public story broke in the 7th week. A tabloid ran a version of it that had Margaret as the calculating architect, who had wormed her way into a grieving old woman's affections at the exact moment her husband's attention was elsewhere. The headline was ugly. The photograph they used was one taken at a public event 3 years earlier, chosen because it made her look cold. She read it once. She sent Clara a message saying she intended to do nothing about it, unless it contained false statements of fact, rather than false statements of character. Clara agreed this was the right call. Her phone that week received a volume of messages she had not experienced before. Some were from people she knew expressing support. Some were from strangers who had seen the article and felt entitled to an opinion. She read none of the stranger messages. She had her assistant set a filter, and she did not think about it again. What she did think about, in the quiet moments between work and sleep, was the shape of the fight itself. Because Eleanor had been right. It was unpleasant. It required Margaret to sit in rooms and be asked questions about her personal life, and her financial decisions, and her relationship with Eleanor and her motivations, in a way that felt like being turned inside out by people who did not know her at all. She answered every question clearly and completely, and she gave them nothing to build a narrative from except the truth, which was that she had been a contributing partner in a marriage and a family company, that she had built things, and that someone had finally noticed. What she had not expected was the exhaustion, not the legal exhaustion, which she had prepared for, but the deeper exhaustion of being mischaracterized for weeks on end, and not being able to correct the record publicly, of having people form opinions about her and carry them around as facts. She was a private person. She had always protected her private life carefully. Having it pulled into the open and examined by people with bad intentions was a different kind of difficult than she had fully accounted for. On a Wednesday evening in the 9th week, she went to the community library project site and stood inside the half-finished reading room. It smelled of fresh concrete and new wood. The windows she had specified for the north wall let in a particular quality of afternoon light that she had calculated on paper 18 months ago, and it was exactly what she had imagined. Exactly. She stood there for 20 minutes. She was still a person who could calculate exactly right. That had not changed. She drove home feeling something closer to herself than she had felt in days. The divorce proceedings ran parallel to the trust case and were, in some ways, simpler. Margaret's legitimate share of the marital assets was substantial and clearly documented. Her silent partnership stake was not in dispute in the divorce proceedings because it was registered in her name and had been for 11 years. Daniel's lawyers made 3 separate attempts to recharacterize it and were turned away each time. The numbers were not on his side. Daniel himself went through a visible shift during this period. He had arrived at the beginning of the legal process with the energy of someone who believed the situation could be managed, who believed that money and lawyers and the particular authority that comes with being the person whose name is on the company door would be enough to bring things back to a manageable shape. As the weeks passed and the challenges were turned back one by one, that energy changed. He became quieter in the legal depositions. He answered questions in a flatter way. He had 2 infant sons. He had a company under pressure. He had a legal fight on 2 fronts. And he had a mother who had not spoken to him with warmth since the day the notification was filed. Margaret thought about him sometimes and felt something that was neither satisfaction nor pity. It was more like the feeling of watching a situation resolve itself according to its own internal logic. She did not speak to him outside of legal contexts. There was nothing to say that was not already being said by the documents. Eleanor, through all of it, was completely steady. She attended every deposition she was required to attend, and she answered every question put to her, with the same clarity she had brought to everything in her life. She was not a woman who could be rattled by lawyers. She had lived through things that would have broken most people, and she had come out of each one with her judgment intact and her position clear. The legal teams that tried to paint her as confused or unduly influenced were faced with a 73-year-old woman who remembered dates and figures and conversations from 6 years ago with complete precision and who had the documentation to match every claim. After one particularly long deposition, Margaret and Eleanor sat together in a conference room while their respective legal teams conferred in the hallway. Eleanor poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table. She looked at Margaret. "You are holding up," she said. "I am," Margaret said. "I knew you would." Eleanor sipped her water. "You have a particular quality. I noticed it at your wedding. When the caterer had an argument with the venue coordinator in the middle of the reception, and everything was on the edge of becoming very awkward, you walked over and you handled it in 4 minutes, and then you went back to your table, and you never mentioned it to anyone." Margaret had forgotten that, but she remembered it now. "A person who can do that," Eleanor said, "can do this." Margaret thought about that for a long time afterward. In the 12th week, Daniel's legal team withdrew one of their 3 main challenges. In the 14th week, they withdrew the second. The remaining challenge went to a judge who read the documentation, asked several precise questions, and dismissed the final filing on a Thursday afternoon. The trust restructuring stood. Clara called Margaret at 4:17 in the afternoon. Margaret was at her desk, reviewing structural specifications for a new project. She answered the phone and Clara told her, and she sat for a moment with the phone in her hand and the late afternoon light coming through her office window, and she said, "Thank you." She finished reviewing the structural specifications. Then she called Eleanor. Eleanor answered on the second ring. "It is done," Margaret said. There was a brief silence on the other end, not the silence of shock, the silence of a person who has been waiting for a specific thing and has just heard it arrive. "Good," Eleanor said. "Come to dinner on Sunday. I am making the soup you like." Margaret said she would be there. She put the phone down. She looked at her desk, at the project files stacked neatly on the left side, at the pencil she still used for initial sketches, at the framed photograph of the first building she had ever designed from start to finish, a small medical clinic in a neighborhood that had needed one badly, and had thanked her for it in a way that she still thought about. She had built things. She had always been building things. And now, for the first time, all of what she had built was properly hers. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in early spring. Margaret signed the last documents at Clara's office at 2:30 in the afternoon. Clara had champagne waiting, but Margaret asked for coffee instead, and they sat together for a while and talked about the next steps and the transfer timelines and the final administrative pieces that needed to fall into place over the following weeks. It was professional and warm, and when Margaret stood to leave, Clara walked her to the door and held it open and said, "It was an honor." Margaret meant it when she said the same back. She walked out into an afternoon that was cool and bright, and full of that particular quality of early spring light that makes everything look recently washed. She stood on the pavement for a moment. A woman walked past with a stroller. 2 men argued cheerfully about something outside a cafe. The city went about its ordinary business around her. She had expected to feel something large. What she felt instead was something quieter, a kind of settling, the way a building settles when all the weight has been correctly distributed. Not dramatic, just right. She had somewhere to be. The new house was 40 minutes outside the city. She had found it through an agent but had not told anyone about it until the purchase was complete, because she had wanted to make the decision entirely alone, with no one else's opinion in the room. It was not grand. It was a 2-story house on a piece of land that had been a small farm at some point, with good light on the south side and an old garden that had gone a little wild, and a room on the upper floor that looked out over a slope of land that went quiet in the evenings in a way that she had needed without knowing she had needed it. She had redesigned the interior herself. She had done it at night and on weekends over the 2 months before the divorce was finalized, and the plans were already with a contractor she trusted. She knew what every room was going to feel like before a single wall had been touched, because she had built it in her mind so completely that walking through it would be a confirmation rather than a surprise. She drove to the house now. She parked in the driveway and got out and walked around to the south side and stood in the thin, early spring warmth and looked at the slope of land and the sky above it. She thought about Eleanor, and the folder on the side table, and the cup of tea, and the word correction. She thought about Clara, and the depositions, and the 14 weeks of fighting in rooms that smelled of photocopier paper, and stale air, and other people's anxiety. She thought about her team at the firm and the community library that had opened 3 weeks ago, in a neighborhood that had needed it badly, and that was already full of people in a way that made her feel the particular satisfaction of having built something that was actually being used. She thought about Daniel briefly, not with bitterness, not with longing, something more neutral. He was a chapter of her life, and the chapter was closed, and what she felt about it now was more like the feeling of finishing a long and complicated book than the feeling of losing something. The twins were 7 months old. She knew this because she tracked time in a general way, not because she sought out information about them. They were two small people who had not asked to be born into any of this. She wished them well with complete sincerity. They were not part of her life, and she harbored nothing about them but a distant and general wish for their health. Amara she had never met and never contacted. She had no feelings about her that she could honestly call negative. She was a young woman in a difficult situation with 2 infants. Margaret was not in the business of adding to other people's difficult situations. She had her own life to build. She had more than enough to build it with. The financial transfer had been completed in stages as the legal process wound down. The trust restructuring money arrived in the account Clara had set up for it, and Margaret sat with her financial advisor and her accountant on a Thursday morning, and they looked at the number together, and she watched both of them work very hard to maintain professional composure, and she appreciated the effort. She had spent a long time the week before thinking about what she wanted the money to do. She was not a person who had spent her life dreaming of luxury. She had a good income and had lived well and comfortably, and the things she had always valued, good light, good work, space to think, did not require an extraordinary sum to maintain. She did not intend to change the way she lived in ways that felt hollow to her. But there were things she wanted to do. The foundation came first. She had thought about it during the hardest weeks of the legal fight, during the nights when she could not sleep, and had gone to her desk and worked through the plans that had been forming for years in the back of her mind. It was a small foundation by the standards of the amount she now had available. It supported 2 things: architecture training grants for young women from low-income backgrounds who wanted to enter the profession, and the development of public buildings in communities that needed them and could not afford the standard process. Libraries, clinics, community halls, the kind of buildings that changed the texture of a neighborhood. She named it quietly. She did not hold a launch event. She did not give interviews about it. She set it up properly, staffed it with people she trusted, and let it start doing what it was supposed to do. Her architecture firm continued. She had told her team nothing about the personal financial situation because it was not relevant to the work. They continued to show up, and she continued to show up, and the work continued to be good. She took on 2 new projects, both public, both in neighborhoods she cared about. She had dinner with Eleanor every 3rd Sunday. They cooked together on a rotating system, which had not been planned, but had emerged naturally from the second dinner, when Margaret had arrived early and found Eleanor already in the kitchen and had simply walked in and started chopping. They talked about architecture and land and family history and the particular satisfactions of work that lasts. They talked about Eleanor's memories of the company's early years, and Margaret realized over many dinners that she was receiving, slowly and over time, an education in a family history that no one had ever bothered to write down. She started writing it down, not for publication, just because Eleanor's memory was a remarkable thing, and Margaret wanted it to exist somewhere beyond the 2 of them. Eleanor, when she learned about this, was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "No one has ever done that." "Someone should have done it years ago," Margaret said. Eleanor nodded once. the nod of a person registering a truth they have always known and have never heard said out loud. She poured more tea. On a Saturday morning, almost exactly a year after the phone had lit up on that kitchen counter on that Tuesday evening, Margaret stood in the completed interior of her new house and walked through every room. The contractor had finished the week before, and she had given the space a few days before entering it properly, alone, at the beginning of a morning when the light was doing what she had calculated it would do. It was exactly what she had planned. Every room, every angle of light. Every decision she had made without asking anyone's opinion. She stood in the upper room that looked over the slope of land, and she watched the morning move across the grass. And she thought about what the past year had taken from her and what it had returned, and what it had revealed. She had walked into this year as a woman who trusted a man she should have examined more carefully, and had discovered, in the wreckage of that trust, things about herself that she had not known were there to find. That she was harder and more capable than she had allowed herself to believe. That the things she had built were real and lasting and were hers regardless of whose name had stood next to them. That there were women in the world, women like Eleanor, who had been watching and had been waiting for the right moment to say so. And that being seen, truly seen, by someone who knew what to look for, was one of the most sustaining things that could happen to a person. She was 42 years old. She had a firm she was proud of, a foundation that was already doing things she cared about, a house she had built exactly to her own specifications, a friendship with a 73-year-old woman who made soup from memory and remembered everything. She was not the person who had sat on the floor of a bedroom with her back against the bed a year ago. She was someone who had been there and had gotten up and had kept going, and had found, on the other side of the hardest year of her life, that she was more than she had been credited for. She was, in fact, exactly what she had always been. The world had simply needed to catch up. She went downstairs and made coffee in the kitchen she had designed to let the east morning light in at exactly this angle, and she sat at the table she had chosen herself, in the house she had built around her own life, and she opened her notebook, and she looked at the plans for the next thing she intended to build, and she began.